Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a Friday Reads one. I haven't done one for a couple of weeks, so I've actually got quite a few books to talk about. Two works of fiction, my first two books for non-fiction November, and a book I can't really classify. Okay, so the first is W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz, Affect by a Canadian author called Charlene Elsby. Those are the two novels. Portable People by Paul West, which I find hard to decide whether it's fiction or non-fiction. It is a series of vignettes about historical people. Yeah, not sure. And then the two non-fiction November, Being You by Anil, Seth, which met the treatment prompt, and Islands of Abandonment, Life in the Post-Human Landscape by Flyn, which is about industrial decay, so meets the prompt for industry. But I'm going to start with the fiction because that's where my heart lies. And I'm going to start with Sebald. So this was a four-way buddy read with Zena over at Beating About the Books, Brian at Bookish, and Courtney Ferreter and I. And Sebald is the type of writer that gives you an awful lot to discuss and talk about on Voxer. And indeed, this book lived up to that. This is my third of Sebald's four novels. And as much as I love The Rings of Saturn, I actually preferred this. Well, I say preferred, I mean, I think this is even better, which I think is probably quite controversial. I say that because he is such a diffuse writer, but actually the themes of this book are much more concrete than in The Rings of Saturn, for all the diffuse style, and I just found that more satisfying somehow. Okay, so Jacques Austerlitz is a four-year-old boy growing up in Prague, was evacuated to Britain on the Kinder transport, being Jewish, just before the Nazis moved into the Czechoslovakia. And he's brought up by a Welsh preacher and has this completely different life than the one that he might have had he stayed in Prague, and is completely unaware of his roots, because at four and a half, he doesn't really have any recall of that. And the book starts with our narrator meeting and liking and beginning a long peripatetic relationship with Jacques Austerlitz, where he's basically bearing witness to Austerlitz's story in various places around Europe. And Austerlitz's story is one where he's gradually moving closer towards stripping away his actual identity as this guy brought up in Britain, now in his 50s, as an academic, writing this great work about architecture that he will never publish, and gradually moving closer and closer towards the truth, which was he was a four and a half year old boy in Prague who was Jewish. And it all starts off when he's at a boarding school just the other side of the Welsh border in England, and he's really thriving both intellectually, academically, but also on the sports field. He's a very good rugby player, and it looks like he could go to Oxbridge, and in order to apply, his headmaster says, okay, well, that's fine, you know, go for it, but you're going to have to use your real name, which is Jacques Austerlitz, which is a name that this boy has never heard before, and it's his actual real name. And that starts the process of him moving towards visiting European cities, you know, looking at records, looking at architecture, trying to find his parents, the history of his parents, which will really be the history of him. And it's you know, apart from the fact that he's a child of the Holocaust, it's a tragic story, because who he is at 57 and who he's lived his whole life since 4.5 is not who he might have been and who he really was. And he had no idea. So, for example, he's in Prague. It's the same next door neighbour, an elderly lady, as when he and his parents were living in the apartment next door. So he's talking to her, and she's talking about a time that they all went to the resort of Marienbad for a holiday when he was 4, so just 6 months before he was evacuated. And he has no memory of that. His only memory of Marienbad was in his 20s or 30s, when he was visited there with a woman who was wooing him and trying to get him to commit to a relationship. And it's so frustrating for him, and it's so tragic as a reader that, you know, the memory he really wants to have, he can't access. And instead he has this overlaid memory of this stuff, which didn't even go anywhere, this relationship with this woman. And that sort of permeates the whole book. You know, Sebald uses photos to enhance this effect, that everything is almost like a double exposure. There's the 4-year-old child beneath, you know, a palimpsest almost, beneath a 57-year-old man, and they're almost schizoid. So, for example, this photo appears in the book and is offered up in the book as a photo of Austerlitz as a page boy before he left Prague. But it isn't anything of the sort. First of all, Jacques Austerlitz is a fictional character. Jacques Austerlitz never existed, therefore how can there be any photos of Jacques Austerlitz? Second of all, we find out by reading the introductory notes that this is just a random photo of some boy in Stockport in the northwest of England. And, you know, there's a picture of the rugby a rugby team in here, which putatively Sebald is saying is the school team that Austerlitz played in. But it's not, it's just some random photo of some random boys rugby team. And he does this all the time with his photos, which he does in his other books as well. And I'm always intrigued to know, and fortunately we have Brian of Bookish on the case because he's reading a new biography of Sebald. You know, did Sebald have the photos first and then sort of shape the narrative around the photos? Or did he seek out photos that would fit the narrative he was writing? I'm sort of very interested in that. So, you know, this is just a wonderful book. It shouldn't work. You know, there's lots of descriptions of architecture. There's, there are no paragraph breaks except each time that the narrator and Austerlitz meet afresh in some new city. So it's long run-on sort of paragraphs and sentences. He veers from talking about architecture to, say, different types of insects or birds. None of this should work, but it does. It's an incredibly easy read. That's the strange thing, you know. There's nothing flashy. It is also diffuse, sort of drawing you into what it really wants to talk about, which is the Holocaust. Then it's actually an easy read. There's no hindrance to understanding. There's no barriers of language. You know, we were doing about 100 pages a week through the month of October, and I would knock that off in 2 half sessions in the same day, 50 pages each. So it's a terrific book. As I say, I think now my favourite Sebald. I haven't read his first book, Vertigo, but you know, and in a way, the chilling thing is that. You used to have the grand tours in the 18th and 19th century where sort of European nobility would visit all the key cities in Europe. And in a way, this book is a depleted grand tour in the post-war era of cities which used to have Jewish populations. You know, we start off in this sort of fortress in Belgium, and then we end up in the fortress at Terezin, the city outside Prague. So you had sorry, it's not a city, it's a town. So you had the town of Terezin. It had a fortress, a historical fortress, and that fortress became a Jewish ghetto. And then there was an annex of that, which is the concentration camp of Theresienstadt, which was the infamous one where the Red Cross demanded to visit a German concentration camp, so the Germans said they could go and visit Theresienstadt as proof of the Germans mounted this complete facade of normal cultured life where there was an orchestra of the Jewish inmates and all this sort of stuff to fob the Red Cross off, which they did, and then they deported most of them to the death camps after the visit was over. So architecture plays a very important role in this, you know, between fortresses and railway stations. Obviously there was the embarkation point for Austerlitz, the 4.5-year-old boy. There was the embarkation of Jews from fortresses, often in Paris and Prague, to the concentration camps. So it's brilliantly done. And again, one final chilling image. So he's talking about how 60,000 people were crammed into the Terezin fortress, into the ghetto there. And he also talks about like an estate where there was a sort of a big pigeon coop, and once the estate is abandoned, the pigeons are left to fend for themselves, and there are all these dead pigeons on the floor covered in the droppings of the other pigeons that are still alive, looking down on them, and it's just a chilling echo of the conditions in Theresienstadt ghetto. And again, just the interesting thing about the architecture is a lot of it is abandoned. And again, he's had the thing about, well, his real name is Jacques Austerlitz, which is the first epiphany that sets it in progress. The next one he has a sort of deja vu when he's sort of touring around Liverpool Street Station as it's being redeveloped. And he has this particular epiphany in the abandoned ladies' waiting room. You know, the fact that you even had separate gendered waiting rooms in the 19th century. So it's completely abandoned. But he has a flashback, because that's, again, where he sort of landed at the other end of the Kindertransport, was at Liverpool Street Station after the ferry from the Hook of Holland. So it's the whole thing is like a memory palace. And the problem for Austerlitz is that he has nothing to populate it, and it's only through the travelling through the book and the travelling through his story that he's able to populate his own memory palace. But again, like I say, a lot of those memories are like double exposures. He can't quite get them into focus because they're overlaid by the life he went on to live. So I'm almost certain this will get to my top 10 books of the year, 5 stars. And on to Effect by Charlene Elsby, who is a Canadian writer and an academic philosopher, which you can tell. And this was recommended to me by Fraser Simons over at Springboard Thought. And so philosophy plays quite a role in a lot of serious fiction. You know, the early novels of Beckett, James Joyce, my own writing, my current work in progress is involving certain philosophical theories. And in a way, why not? Because one branch of philosophy is the theory of consciousness, the theory of mind, the theory of perception, all that sort of thing, more of which later in Non-Fiction November. So the first third of this is a lot of that, and I loved it. It's basically a female student, a philosophy student, starts a relationship with this guy, who she describes as larger than life. And that sets off a sort of inquiry into the sort of entanglement of relationship, because formerly she was a single body moving through space, having to only think about her own behaviours and thoughts and stuff. But when she's hooked up with this guy, suddenly, are they two? Are they 1.5? You know, what dimensionality does their relationship have? Does he walk ahead and she walk behind? Do they walk arm in arm? And you know, it's almost a sort of calculus of relationship, and how much, you know, now she has to not only think about her own needs and behaviours and position in space, but she has to take into account this guy who she loves. Very much in the vein of Ben Marcus and Blake Butler, both of whom authors I love. So, you know, of course I was going to love this. It's more philosophical. It's more overtly philosophical than their works. And then we move into sort of section 2, where the body count starts rising. The people who get in their way, even in sort of quite trivial circumstances, wind up dead. And I wasn't quite sure whether this was like Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, where you're deliberately not supposed to know if they were actually killing these people, or if it was all just some sort of mental projection. And that was fine for me to have that ambiguity, on the assumption that I was going to get a clue as to which of the two, or if it was something else, which I didn't, because then we lurched into part 3, where I felt a lot of the energy just dribbled away, didn't really go anywhere, their relationship sort of fizzled out, which is not really a spoiler because it's not that type of book. And I just found the philosophical musings that were broached in parts 1 and to a lesser degree in part 2 sort of were almost dropped in part 3, unless I just sort of missed them. So it was a curious. I mean, I give it four stars, because that first third and even the second third were really entertaining for me. But I did feel a bit lost by part 3. I just felt it didn't really go anywhere. Definitely going to read some more of her work though. And on to Portable People by Paul West, who is a British author but who moved to America and was basically, you know, did all his work out there. He was married to Diane Ackerman, the poet, and I think who wrote Something like A History of the Senses. Hang on a second. Yeah, here we go. She wrote this book, An Actual History of the Senses. Very good it is too. Paul West was married to her. So this is what it says. It's sort of, I don't know exactly how many, it's 150, 200 little one-page or two-page vignettes. That's Ava Perron. Each illustrated, Martin Bormann, by Joe Cervello. And the extraordinary thing is how different, how unique each of the voices are for all of these characters. When I say characters, they're real life people. That's a hell of an achievement. Lots of modern composers, lots of people involved with aeroplanes, sort of flying them, like the Red Baron, or I think Amy writes it somewhere, but also people who produce them and stuff. My favourites, for what it's worth, were Niccolo Paganini, which is surprising because I'm not into classical music, Maurice Maeterlinck, the Austrian diplomat, Marie Curie, Sacheverell Sitwell, who I think was Edith Sitwell's brother, who I knew nothing about, Richard Hillary, the guy who conquered Everest, Simone Weil, who's someone I'm very fond of her work. And then I just want to read this about Rosamund Franklin, to give you an idea of the style. Rosamund Franklin, if you didn't know, was the woman who was credited with the discovery of DNA, although everyone remembers Crick and Watson, not her, even though it's her photos. They built a sort of 3D model, but it was her photos who first sort of revealed that the strand of DNA was a double helix. She blotted the page and closed the book, somehow unwilling to be more obvious than that. I didn't see it, she told them later, but she had. Her trumpet was quieter, that was all, and knowledge was its own reward, like love. They were gentlemen and scholars about it, putting her name along with theirs on the history-making paper. She died in 1958, 5 years after the discovery that brought them their Nobels in 1962. But there are no posthumous Nobels. It was as if, plucked away from them by cancer, she had saved herself from some vulgar follow-through, a mutual curtsy between King's College London and the Cavendish Laboratory, Cambridge. She had noted that the structure was a kind of soixante neuf, and so almost Parisian. God's frightful head had neared her lap, and she had not flinched, this true dark lady of this cosmic sonnet, knowing the phosphates would still be on the outside even after the red giant of our sun had fried the planet she worked upon. I just loved some of the writing in this. God's frightful head had neared her lap, and she had not flinched. So this was a terrific read. This is 4.5 stars. I don't know what to categorise it as, though. And on to Non-Fiction November. So, Being You, a new science of consciousness by a academic from Sussex University, where both my sons studied, called Anil, Seth. Now, it says a new science of consciousness, and it kind of isn't. I find books like this very often are much more like a survey of the current thinking on the subject, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't think there's a coherent new science theory of consciousness in this. So I just wanted to say that. But it is very good. It starts off with something that I've always believed, that perception is not a case of external objects in the world being perceived by our eyes, our nose, our ears and that, and they're drawing the sensory imagery and data from those external objects, sending to the brain, and therefore the brain has a picture of what the external world is. He says, and this is something I've always felt myself, no, it's the other way around, that the brain makes a best guess of what's out there, and it's then the information that the senses feed back on that projection, how it matches stuff out there, then the brain sort of, adjusts its theory accordingly. And that's the bedrock of current theory of consciousness. He then goes on to sort of glom on some other ideas and associated theories from other fields, which lost me a bit, I must admit. I wasn't convinced by them. And I will also say there was a bit more maths in the very early chapters than I was expecting, but that doesn't persist throughout the book. And there's not much more to say, really, other than when I did my empathy and reading video last week, which I'll post a link to. And I start off with that gallery of faces of people who didn't exist. I got I wasn't aware of that. I got that from this book, which mentioned it when it went on to talk about facial recognition and the importance of facial recognition in, throughout our development, particularly as babies and stuff. So a really good, solid, bringing you up to speed as to where current thinking lies on human consciousness. And while it admits that there's a hell of a long way to go to fully nail it, but 4 stars. And onto Islands of Abandonment, Life in the Post-Human Landscape. So this looks at really the poetics of ruin, but it takes it from a perspective I wasn't anticipating, which is a sort of an ecological perspective, how nature manages to grow back and in the main fill these sort of abandoned areas, these deserts or whatever, which I was always aware of because I'm, fascinated by ziggurats that get reclaimed by the jungle, the Temple of Angkor Wat in Cambodia that was reclaimed by the jungle and only rediscovered in the late 18th or early 19th century by a French explorer. So I was aware of that dynamic. This is more specifically about how nature adapts and grows back, with one exception where she talks about Verdun from the First World War, which had over 1 million bombs dropped on it, so that it's described like something like the equivalent of 10,000 years of soil erosion in 4 years because of all the ordnance dropped on it and stuff. So that's about the only place where even nature can't grow back. And she offers it as a slightly ambiguous, there's always hope, for all the toxins and rust and everything that we unleash on the environment and then walk away, having sort of trashed it, that nature is resilient and comes back in surprising ways. I'm not sure I buy that, and it's a hopeful message, one would like to buy it, but I'm not sure I am. So this is very heavily ecological, rather than about the poetics of decay, which was initially my point of entry and my interest. I don't think her writing is good enough, is literary enough, to be very good about the poetics of decay. You almost have to be lyrical, and she isn't. She's not lyrical at all, and a lot of the language is repeated in different places. But, there are some strengths about this. I learnt about Paterson, New Jersey, which I was unaware of, was the first pre-planned industrial town where Alexander Hamilton had seen the waterfalls there. And his reaction was, wow, we could use this to power mills and factories and stuff. And that's exactly what they did. They built, and of course now it's completely destroyed with environmental toxins. That whole part of the New Jersey, New York coast, and Pennsylvania coast and stuff. With a really, this is an example of good writing. So she's talking about PCBs, which is a chemical product used in pesticides, which have been banned since the 1970s by America because they're so sort of toxic. In the Arctic, the bodies of Inuit people, those subsisting on traditional diets featuring seal and narwhal meat, have been found to contain such high concentrations of PCBs and other chemicals that they could be classified as hazardous waste. I mean, that's the kind of chilling image any environmental message needs, that humans are so toxified through their environment, their food and stuff, that they should have the danger toxic waste signage around them. And I just think that's powerful and great writing. But then on the other hand, we have this. So talking about Glasgow, talking about Detroit and the blight that hit Detroit. If the goal of modernism was social revival, then it failed. In the tower blocks, it became obvious that something deep and intangible and profound had been lost. Something that had been there all along, by which he means community. It sounded like this: the renting of clothes, the tearing of cloth, beware amputation, beware the pulling out by the roots. I just don't think that's very interesting writing. It sounded like this: the renting of clothes. No, it didn't. It would have sounded like bulldozers. The tearing of cloth, beware amputation, beware pulling out the roots. I don't really see how that metaphor works. So there's good and bad writing in it. just to give you an idea of the seas that she's covering. So the no man's land dividing the island of Cyprus. The nuclear winter of Chernobyl, obviously, that's an obvious one. The blight of Detroit, as I say, Paterson, New Jersey, which I did find interesting. Then we had Verdun in the First World War, the massive soil erosion through high explosive. Tanzania, which was about a sort of as a German colony, it had all this sort of scientific laboratory, which obviously fell into disrepair when the Germans lost their empire after the First World War. And a lot of the imported species of plant, particularly bamboo, that the Germans had brought in, just sort of ran riot and became non-native species, but affecting the delicate native ecological balance. Montserrat after the volcanic explosion. So I think you're going to find it to be more interested in some than others, as I was. I also felt that she should have stuck to what she was talking about in the chapter. So when she talked about Detroit, which is the one I was most interested in a way, the one that I felt was the least engaging, she then went on to talk about sort of the reurbanisation of Glasgow, tearing down the old tenement blocks and putting up tower blocks, and how that destroyed community, which I thought, I know why she's talking about these, but I felt it actually took away the focus of Detroit, whereas it was supposed to enhance it. So yeah, I was a bit disappointed in this, to be honest. I gave it 3 stars. And there you have it. That was my Friday reads. So thanks very much. Till next time.